Well, good afternoon, everybody. And we're going back to the 1930s again. And as you recall, last week, um, our speaker, Richard MacMaster, carried us through sort of the early days of the New Deal, when really the priority was getting people back to work. Um, Immediately following that, and probably through the rest of the period of the New Deal, which really went almost up to World War II, just in terms of historical um, placing of things in timeline. Um, there were many other things that the New Dealers did to try to strengthen the economy and um, and really build government in the United States into what it would take to be a modern um, capitalist society. And that's what Richard's going to talk about today. So our speaker, Richard MacMaster, known to all of you, give him a warm welcome. And Richard, it's all yours.
Thank you. Good. In the 1930s, in the depth of the Depression, bankers and stockbrokers, nearly all of whom were fine, upstanding people, had a bad reputation. It, in popular mind, the causes of much of the suffering of people came from the financial and investment policies of the previous year, the wild excesses of the 1920s. And while, as I say, hardly any stockbroker behaved like Belmont in The Way We Live Now, if you remember the book or anything else about it, selling shares in railroads that didn't exist, or gold mines that had no potential for bringing in anything. Uh, there had been no control over what you could do on the stock market. So, as a matter of fact, if you had wanted to offer shares in a railroad in Antarctica and you could find people who wanted to buy them, there was nothing that anybody could do to prevent you. So, this was the reason why uh, in 1934, before uh, Roosevelt came into office, there was a Senate Banking Committee. Let's see if I can get this going here. Am I going the right way? Oh, well, I forgot this was coming up here. Well, let's come back to this then in a minute. Anyway, we keep in mind that there's going to be a lot of interest in doing something to curb excesses in the stock market and in banking. But one of the first things that we need to remember, and it's almost shocking in some ways, 1932, the Federal Economy Act, which to begin with prohibited more than one person in a household having a paying job. So if you were, let's say, a school teacher and your wife was a school teacher, one of you had to quit because that would be taking work away from unemployed people. And it rather viciously, one might think, cut 400 billion in veterans benefits. And these were not pensions paid to people who just happened to have spent a year or two in the armed services. This is the kind of thing where these people were 100% disabled. and it cut 100 million in salaries across the board from federal employees. That was the kind of desperation we were in then. I'd forgotten I was going to put that in. All right, now, so who is going to look into setting this up, looking into the bad behavior of the stock markets or the banks? Well, the Senate Committee on Banking and Currency. And they began hearings in January 1933, and the uh, gosh, what is your title if you're doing that? The attorney who was in charge of the committee, not a senator but a lawyer, was a man named Ferdinand Pecora. Now, not quite in the 1930s, but a good many years ago, when I was a graduate student, I was doing research for Camel Phillips of the New York Times Washington Bureau, who was writing a book about the 1930s. And one of my assignments was to go and interview Ferdinand Pecora. And Judge Pecora of the New York State Supreme Court was then, of course, long retired. He was about as old then as I am now. And he was a very gracious man. He was very pleasant when I called on him, but he didn't want me to be just wasting his time. So he said, you know, I told everything I know to an oral history program at Columbia University, and I'm going to give you the transcripts, and you can take anything you want out of that and just bring them back to me. So that was my brief encounter with Ferdinand Pecora. But I thought he was a remarkable man, and I think the country did in general. Now, if I get too rambly, excuse me, because I'm just another old man who likes to talk. So anyway, uh, Ferdinand Pecora was born of peasant parents in a little village in Sicily. And he came here as a child, a very young child. And by just, as they like to say, pulling himself up on his own bootstraps, he gradually got through CCNY in New York, and then through law school, and then became ultimately a very eminent jurist. And one of those pictures is from the Pecora Committee, and in it, J.P. Morgan is talking with Pecora, and that was what this committee did. It brought all of these great men of American finance and had them answer questions, and some of them were very gracious and some of them were not. But at any rate, it resulted then in the Securities Act of May 1933, which did a couple of things. I think I've got these. It eliminated misrepresentation and fraud in the stock market. How did it do that? It created a Federal Trade Commission. Well, actually, the Federal Trade Commission was already there. It required companies to register with the FTC and to provide full financial data before issuing shares, and make all of this readily available to any potential investor under a penalty. And the Federal Trade Commission would enforce this, which included barring the person who was making these false impressions from further dealing with this. And that was May 1933. The reason we have pictures there of Benjamin Cohen is Benjamin Cohen, who was another young attorney in the New Deal, was a man who would write the bill creating the Securities and Exchange Commission. And he was the son of immigrants from Eastern Europe. And he was born in Muncie, Indiana, but his family hadn't been very long from a shuttle in what I guess would now be Ukraine. And the reason I like to put those two together is in the 1930s and right up till 1968, the federal immigration law was basically aimed at keeping people like the Pecoras and the Cohens out of this country. That we did not want Eastern European immigrants. We did not want Southern European immigrants. And we had quotas and so on. And it makes me think, a little bit of a commercial here, it makes me think that maybe there are Riveras and Hernandezes on the Mexican border right now who would be the Ferdinand Pecoras and the Benjamin Cohens in another 40 years. So this was a kind of legacy here. So Benjamin Cohen wrote the Securities Act of October 1934, which created the Securities and Exchange Commission and gave it a mandate to enforce provisions of the 1933 Securities Act. Now, the Glass-Steagall Banking Act came right after the first act that came out of the Pecora Committee. And this is a very important one, because you will notice the little picture there is that it separated commercial banks from investment banks. So you were separating banks that basically took the savings of people and granted loans to businesses or mortgaged houses or whatever. You separated that from those who were players in the financial market. And it was considered, and I suspect rightly so, that that was a very good idea. And if you remember, not all that, well, yeah, let's follow this up. Well, again, let me just separate it. That if you remember, not that many years ago, those provisions were repealed and you had the two mixed together again. And the result was basically the 2008 recession. So the Glass-Steagall Act was written in this case by a Virginian. When at one point we moved to Ohio, my daughter said in a class, they had a class on Ohio history in her high school, that she said, well, nothing happened in Ohio except when Virginians came here. And Carter Glass was an eminent Virginian. He was from Lynchburg, Virginia. He had been a newspaper publisher. And then in 1899, he was elected by the legislature to the United States Senate. He had served in the United States Senate until the Wilson administration, when he was made Secretary of Treasury. And after he was no longer Secretary of the Treasury, he was again elected, this time by popular vote, as Senator from Virginia. And he wrote personally the Glass-Steagall Banking Act. Mr. Steagall was a congressman from Indiana, I believe, who put his name on it. It separated commercial and investment banking, and that meant the banks could use their funds for lending and not for investing. They could not buy various kinds of bonds or whatever kind of financial packages were put together as they'd been more recently in banking. It created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which Franklin Roosevelt bitterly opposed. He didn't want this in the bill at all because he thought it would drain the Treasury. But that is the thing that makes it up to a fairly substantial amount, that if the bank fails, you don't lose everything you put in the bank, which had caused so much misery in the early part of the Depression. And it enabled the Federal Reserve to regulate banks. Banks couldn't just do anything they pleased. So these were actually pretty good measures all across the board. Now, the other part of developing protecting the economy really was the National Recovery Administration, part of the National Industrial Recovery Act of June 1933, and the Blue Eagles were everywhere. And what did this do? It required industry-wide codes of fair competition. All right. Now, this is a very major intervention by the federal government. It's saying that if you were in the steel business, or if you were in the business of printing postcards, that you could not just operate on your own. Bethlehem Steel could not function without U.S. Steel. And if you were the Gainesville Historic View postcard company, you had to be in careful connection with everybody else who printed souvenir postcards anywhere. So with every other business, they had very quickly, they had hundreds and hundreds of these codes. And what did those codes involve? They did a couple of things. They fixed both wages and profits. So you couldn't just pay people what you thought might be the market price in Gainesville. You had to pay them what was the market price in New York, and New York couldn't pay more than they could in Savannah and so on. And they established production quotas. This was a great deal of the part of the fair competition. That if your steel mill or your automobile factory could produce many, many more tons of material than anybody else, you couldn't do it. You had to agree that we'll all have the same share of the market. And at the same time, because fixing wages and not doing anything else wasn't exactly an inducement for the workers, the employees were guaranteed the right to organize unions and also the right either to join or not join a union. And there's a stamp there that shows everybody working together, everybody doing our part. The NRA drew up more than 500 codes for large and small industries. Was it self-regulation, which was the way it was proposed to the people who had to be part of this? It's you're going to draw up the code. Nobody in Washington is going to impose it on you. Or was it a managed economy? And in that little cartoon, Uncle Sam has labor and capital happily working together with the Blue Eagle on their lapel. Now, this is actually getting a bit ahead of where I wanted to be. All right. So that's where we are in 1933 with the NRA. Everything is gradually coming into these industrial codes. At the same time, we had the passage of the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which wanted to do much the same thing for agriculture, to have a reduction of the amount of it wasn't all crops, it was specialized ones, including tobacco and cotton and wheat and corn and milk products. And I think that was the totality that they required, again, that there would be national quotas and national agreements to work within this. Now, by 1935, farm income was 59% higher than in 1932, but trouble was brewing. And we'll see what was happening there. Now, one of the problems with the Agricultural Adjustment Act, certainly from our viewpoint many years later, is that reducing acreage in cotton meant reducing the number of tenants and sharecroppers, that the payment to the farmer would be paid to the person who owned the land. And if I owned a large piece of land and a substantial part of it was leased to tenants or to sharecroppers, when I wanted to reduce the acreage, I automatically reduced the number of tenants and the number of sharecroppers. And this gave an enormous impetus to the movement of poor blacks to the north, hoping to find some kind of employment there because they couldn't continue to live where they were living, which is a sort of a downside of AAA. All right. Now, but it did achieve the improvement in farm economy. And here, this cartoon is probably hard to read, but the AAA is responsible for all these good things that are laid out in front of the cow. But there's a fat man over there who is saying that the only thing we need to do is to kill the cow, and then everything will be fine. So, in May 1935, the Supreme Court decided in the ALA Schechter poultry case regarding a New York City live poultry dealer indicted for violating a poultry industry code. And in that cartoon, there is Charles Evans Hughes, the very eminent and maybe one of the absolute best. He was Chief Justice, but Supreme Court justices of all time, is shooting down the AAA bird. Well, there's a bit of a background to this. And bear with me. All right. In 1934, in the Hoover administration, the Congress passed a bill called the National Railway Retirement Act. And the reason that they wanted to pass it was they thought that people employed on the railways in whatever capacity who were getting on in years, if they would only retire, would open up jobs to some of the multitudes of unemployed and perfectly competent people who were becoming adrift practically. So in order to get this through the Congress, the argument was that it was not to create jobs, it was to ensure the safety of rail communications and thus of interstate commerce. And a case was brought by the Alton Railway Company that was decided almost before the ink on the bill was dry that this was not proper, that they were expanding interstate commerce to beyond reason, and that the real purpose had been to create jobs, and that it was unfair to impose paying a pension on the various railroad companies. So that bill was struck down. And in 1935, there were a couple of other cases that were suggesting that the court might or might not decide against the New Deal, major New Deal legislation. But the Schechter case, they argued, the attorneys for Schechter argued that, first of all, this was not interstate commerce, that it was a live poultry business, and that they supplied markets in and around greater New York. So they didn't even fall under interstate commerce. And further, that it was an unlawful aggregation of power to the executive, who was able to order these things, these codes and so on, by the Congress, which really had no power. So at one stroke, the basic New Deal National Industrial Recovery Act, covering virtually everything, was struck down in May 1935. And Roosevelt was very angry at this, that he thought the court had vastly overreached. And this is more of Schechter. His conviction was appealed all the way to the Supreme Court. It took some time, and the court then invalidated NRA and all its works. And so, what do we do there? There was a strong attempt to salvage the basics, and this was in June 1935, the Congress passed the Wagner Act. Robert Wagner, senator from New York, was in fact the author of this bill. And it was very much his idea. And it, as we'll see, protected the rights of unions. You notice in that poster, if I want to work in a factory, the first thing I do would be to join a union. And that's a quote from the president. So it created the National Labor Regulations Act of 1935, guaranteed the right to organize and to join a union, the right to collective bargaining. It wasn't just that you could have a union, but the union had the absolute right to require that the employer sit down with you and bargain. And it created the National Labor Relations Board to arbitrate any kind of dispute. So there it is. And one of the immediate results of that was that the American Federation of Labor had always favored just organizing very skilled workers, so that if you and for good practical reasons, that if you had key people who did something that couldn't be easily replaced, it gave you some power. If you just had a bunch of people who had limited or no skills, then there was no problem replacing them. And so the employer could very well ignore the union. But within the AFL, led by John Llewellyn Lewis, of the great bushy eyebrows, the head of the United Mine Workers, and funded by the United Mine Workers, was the AFL Committee for Industrial Organizing, which was formed in 1935. And what they wanted to do was to organize great big unions for entire industries. So if you worked for the Ford Motor Company, no matter what you did, you would be eligible to be in the United Auto Workers. And similarly, they wanted to organize steel, the airplane manufacturing, and the garment industries. One of the key players in creating what then became the CIO was the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. And here we are with organizing industrial workers in 1935-37. And it led to, well, let's go back here. That led to quite a number of strikes, very large scale strikes, organizing, after all, across a whole industry, rather than just, say, organizing Ford in Dearborn. It was taking all the automobile plants in the country. And many of these strikes were what were borrowed from the continent of Europe in sit-down strikes, where we don't leave the plant and walk around outside with placards. we just stay where we are on our workstations, so they can't do anything. They can't even bring in scams and so on. So it was a very heated time. But one of the results of it, obviously, was, and of the Wagner Act in general, was it created a very big, strong union movement in the United States, and one that was a key player in the Democratic Party, very much like the trades unions in the Labor Party in Britain, or I guess on the continent also. So in January 1936, the Supreme Court got around to officially invalidating the Agricultural Administration Act. And very quickly in March, they came up with the Soil Conservation and Domestic Allotment Act. And that was to say that we were paying you, the landowner, for not growing wheat, let's say, beyond a certain level, because you were contributing to the terribly low prices that all wheat farmers were getting. If you would just cut back your production and everybody else will do that, then prices will rise. Well, actually, that worked. But now they're saying we're not doing that to raise prices. We're not doing that to reduce production. We're doing that for the very good and readily defensible reason that we have had terrible flooding, we have had dust bowls, we've had all these things in the last few years. We're now trying to fight that with soil conservation. And then we're going to pay you for taking care of the good earth. And here's a poster for it. It said, we are not, unlike the AAA, which had taxed the people who processed the food in order to generate the money to pay the farmer. This would just be from general taxation to Treasury in general. Then farmers would be paid for taking marginal land out of production, introducing new crops like soybeans. And again, it favored large landowners everywhere. And where there were large numbers of tenants and sharecroppers, it did absolutely nothing for them except basically get on the road. Now, the Social Security Act of August 1935, created largely by Francis Perkins, who was the had the Committee on Economic Security that was set up in 1934. It paid persons over 65 $10 to $85 a month, funded by a payroll tax paid by employers and employees, and created the Federal Insurance Contribution Act to enable those payments to be made. And we're all familiar with that. There's Francis Perkins is right behind Franklin Roosevelt, being the only woman in the picture. And the New Deal coalition and the 1936 election, this, I don't quite remember this, but a lot of family and people that I knew had rather regretted Alf Landon hadn't won 1936. But as you can see, the Franklin Roosevelt in the Electoral College carried every state. So as Maine goes, so goes Vermont. And that was the end of that. Now, some of the opposition to the New Deal continued very strongly. A couple of cartoons there. And it was all about the concentration of power, depending on which side of the political uh, uh, fence you grew up on. You may have been very used to saying that Franklin Roosevelt had saved the country and everything that was good in it was due to the New Deal, or, as I'm afraid I did, you might feel that it had concentrated all this power unnecessarily and inappropriately in a lot of bureaucrats in Washington. So there was that division continued. But whatever one thought, Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal had made an indelible mark on American society. So that's about all I have to say, and I'm sure I talked too long.
Thank you. Thank
Okay,
you,
I did-
Richard. Well, that's a lot to absorb. I think I remember a joke that one of the comedians in the early 30s said it was something about the Congress, the Democratic Congress after Roosevelt was elected, didn't so much read the bills that were being presented as waved at them as they went by, because they really did crank out a lot of legislation in a short period of time, all aimed toward first employing people and then trying to fix the fundamental problems in the economy, which is what we talked about today, and we'll probably continue to be talking about it for years to come. Any questions?
I do have a question in chat. It says, how long did the one job per family law last?
That,
Remember one of the beginning slides?
I don't know whether that was a time-limited bill. It probably was, because there was always a lot of optimism that the economy is going to turn around, and not that we would have terrible unemployment for the next 10 years or so. But I think everybody remembers that kind of situation, that if you, well, I'm going to give you a quick illustration that my mother-in-law graduated from college and went to teach in a public school, and she had to pretend, because once she got married, she had to pretend that she wasn't married. So it must have lasted through the 30s that you couldn't have a husband and wife both working. So there we are. We got a question in the back.
Well, more comment, or two comments. One first, thank you. You said you're an old person who likes to speak. I guess we're old people who like to listen. So keep speaking. Second, I don't know if you noticed, but there was one of the newspaper clippings, 1936. Do you know what it said the budget deficit was? And it was the headline.
You remember?
It said the deficit for the US budget is going to be $1 billion. You know what it is today? Yeah.
oh, it's all inflation.
All right, let's go to Zoom. John Reiskin, go ahead.
Just a question. When I was in high school, I spent a summer working in a laboratory and with a bunch of high school fellow students from all over. And one of them was a guy named of Tyler Tugwell. And that didn't mean anything to me. And at the end of the summer, my father picked me up, and I mentioned this kid, Tyler Tugwell, whose father was Rexford Tugwell. So I went to the encyclopedia because I didn't know either. And it turns out he was part of this brain trust. So I'm curious. I don't know if I missed the first few minutes of your talk, but could you tell me something about that brain trust of Roosevelt and it's significant? Did they think up all these programs? Was there, how did they come? I mean, when they passed major legislation in May of 1933, he took office only less than 2 months earlier. They seemed to be full speed ahead when he was inaugurated. And I'm curious about that period before he took office and how they got so much done in so little time.
Yeah, there were, I can't rattle off the names of all of them. Harold Ickes was one, and Rex Tugwell, and a number of household names, but they were all people who were economists and agricultural specialists and things like that, who had been probably thinking for years about what would be a good thing to do, and who were now empowered by the president, who didn't have all that many original ideas himself, to sit down and say, well, what could we do with this? How should we do that? And one of the other things that they did have to deal with, and it's interesting that the number of measures were very close to war measures adopted in the Wilson administration. And the difference being, and why there was more opposition, obviously, the difference being that in wartime, you think, oh, of course, there's nothing wrong with consolidating control of production of important materials or transportation. But would we want that in peacetime? And basically, the people in the Brains Trust and the administration then generally felt, yeah, this is a crisis, just like wartime, and we really have to make these permanent kind of changes.
Diane?
Yes.
Wait just a moment, Diane. We'll get you on the mic. That way our Zoom audience can hear.
The One Person Employment Act was still working in the 50s in the hometown where I was born and raised. My mother and father, when they got married, did not live together for over a couple of years because they needed both incomes in order to build the house. So my mother stayed with her parents and my father stayed with his parents. They had eloped. So nobody except one of my father's 12 siblings knew that they had eloped. And as soon as the law changed, then my parents could get back together. And that was early in the 50s. And the town was Wisconsin Rapids, Wisconsin, and my father and mother were employed by different companies.
Ron,
Very
we have one
fair.
up here
Yes.
too. Let's get Paul Parker on Zoom while we're moving the mic.
Okay, thank you. I think I've got it on mute finally.
No, you're good. Go ahead.
Yeah, right. Richard, you alluded to the labor movement, looking to how things were happening with labor unions in Europe and copied some of their tactics. I'm wondering also whether we were borrowing any of this, because there was depression in Europe at the same time. Any other ideas that we thought applied to our situation with the economy, the socialist movement, communist movements, particularly socialist movements, were pretty strong in Europe. And a lot of people are accusing, apparently, Roosevelt of being a socialist. And at the same time, Hitler was borrowing a lot of his racial ideas, including segregation and his anti-Semitic tactics, were being swapped or sent back to Europe. And I wondered whether there were other facets of the tactics that were used to raise the economy, agriculture, movements, and so forth that we borrowed from what was going on in Europe, trying to attack the same problem. It was really a worldwide depression.
Yeah, I'm sure there were. I always thought that in some ways, the 30s were a very open time
Mm,
in that you could be a conservative Republican, you could be a liberal Democrat, you could be a socialist, you could run for office under the Communist Party,
yes.
you could, and colleges had groups of all these ideas, and where people were, or even fascism. You could say that, Senior Mussolini is the man who has the answer.
Right.
What they're doing is the way we should go. So there was a great deal of ferment like that.
Yes.
And I'm sure that came in. I've a silly personal story. When I was a little boy, I cast my first vote, perhaps illegally, because my aunt held me up and let me pull the lever. But I was pulling the lever for her high school friend, Rosamond Clark, who was running for, I think, New York State Assembly or something like that, on the Trotskyite Workers' Party.
Yes.
So you could be an avowed Trotskyite if you
Yes.
wanted to in those years.
The Socialist Party and the Communist Party were legitimate parties and did run candidates, and Norman Thomas and the Socialists were very strong.
All right, question in the Oak Room?
Hello.
Got it. My father was a Wall Street attorney, and he was involved in fighting Roosevelt, and he came up with the idea for the tactic to use to find the Third Amendment illegal. And it was successful. It was passed. But the minute it was passed, Roosevelt had the Sixth Amendment passed, which made that attempt void.
Well done.
Well, I think this is there was a constant give and take in that period, wasn't there, between the people who were finding cases to strike down these quote socialist initiatives, and then some fast-footed attorneys on the administration side were finding ways to get around it. I think that's probably what was going on mostly in the 30s. Any other thoughts here? Okay, well, Richard, thank you very much. We really appreciated this.
Thank you, audience.
Now, next week, Barbara Oberlander will be joining us, and she will be speaking on the role of Eleanor Roosevelt in the New Deal. And as you all know, Eleanor was a very strong personality, and Roosevelt relied on her heavily to help sell the New Deal, and that's what we'll find about next week. Thanks. Bye.